Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're kind of wading into these SaaS metrics, and it's like sometimes you feel like we're drowning in data,
Right.
but we're throwing a lifeline. We're tackling those definitions, activated versus active accounts.
Yeah, and you've got some really great material here from Integromat, which is now
Really?
really diving deep into, the trenches of real-world experience.
Absolutely. And they were grappling with these definitions, trying to figure out what actually moves the needle, which is harder than it sounds, right?
Yeah.
Like it's easy to get caught up in vanity metrics and lose sight of what really matters
For sure.
for growth. So,
Yeah, and what's fascinating here is the author really emphasizes, going beyond just counting logins or signups. It's about understanding those actions, those behaviors that actually signal real engagement and value for the user.
okay, so let's unpack this because
Yeah.
they start by talking about activated accounts and this idea of an activation milestone. For someone who's new to this, what does that even mean?
So it's really about pinpointing that one key action that a user takes that demonstrates they get it, that they've experienced that aha moment where the value proposition clicks for them.
It's like that part in the movie where the protagonist finally realizes what's at stake. And you're like, okay, now things are getting interesting.
Exactly. And the author uses the example of Integromat, now Make, and they initially define this milestone as a user creating and activating their first scenario, which is essentially a workflow.
Okay.
But here's the catch, just turning it on wasn't enough.
It had to run. It had to actually run successfully.
It had to work.
So I'm sensing a theme here. It's not about just using the feature. It's about experiencing the intended outcome.
Absolutely. Yeah, anyone can create a to-do list, but it's that moment when you actually check off the first item and you think, wow, this actually works. That keeps you coming back for more, right?
Right. And that makes me think about how the definition of an activated account can't be static. It has to kind of evolve as your product does, right?
Right. And the author talks about how their initial focus was on simplicity to try to drive those activation rates, make it as easy as possible for people to get to that first milestone.
Okay.
But as they learned more about user behavior, they realized that a more robust definition might actually involve something a bit more substantial.
Like actually seeing them engage with it in a meaningful way.
Exactly. So for Integromat, that meant not just creating a scenario, but having it run successfully multiple times, maybe even, at least 5 times, to ensure that people were truly grasping that value.
Okay.
And this is where we get into input metrics.
Okay, so input metrics are kind of like the building blocks of how we define an activated account.
Precisely. Yeah, they provide the data points to track those key actions. And the author gives the example of Mixpanel, which is another SaaS product.
Okay.
And they define an activated account based on 2 main input metrics. 1, whether a user has created a report in the platform, and 2, the number of users within a workspace.
So let me get this straight. If I'm using Mixpanel and I've created a report, that's one check mark.
Check.
And if I'm collaborating with others in a workspace, that's another indicator that I'm like actively using the product.
Exactly. Those 2 factors, creating a report and having multiple users in the workspace, tell Mixpanel that someone is using their product in a way that goes beyond just, kicking the tires. They're invested, they're collaborating, they're getting value.
Which is what we want,
Exactly.
ultimately, with our products.
For sure.
So we've covered activated. Now let's flip the coin and talk about active accounts. How is that different? Because it seems like it would be very similar.
Yeah, the key difference here is the time dimension.
Okay.
So while activated signifies that one-time aha moment, active is about ongoing engagement.
Okay.
It's about defining what actions or behaviors indicate that a user is consistently finding value in your product. And to do that, you need to specify a time frame.
So are we talking daily, weekly, monthly? How do we even choose?
That really depends on your product and how frequently users typically engage with it. But the key is to be able to answer the question, how many accounts are active right now?
Right.
Which is crucial for understanding the health of your SaaS business.
Because an account that was active yesterday may not be active today.
Exactly.
And if you're just looking at monthly active users, you're missing a lot of what's happening.
Exactly. And here's where it gets really interesting, is that those specific actions that define an active account can be drastically different between products.
Okay.
So let's stick with Mixpanel for a moment. Since users need to regularly log in and interact with those reports to get value, active might mean viewing reports frequently, right?
Okay.
But for a product like Integromat, where workflows are running behind the scenes, active might look totally different.
Right. Like they're just happening automatically.
Exactly.
So then how do you measure engagement when they aren't constantly, in the product?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. And it's why defining active is so much more than just picking a metric and calling it a day. It really requires a deep understanding of user behavior and what truly drives value for your specific product.
So it's like we're comparing apples and oranges here,
Mhm.
right? You can't measure a project management tool the same way you'd measure like a marketing automation platform.
Exactly. And even within those categories, you'll find tons of variation.
Right.
For example, a project management tool that's really focused on team collaboration might define active based on, the number of tasks assigned, comments made, file shared, that kind of thing.
Versus something that's more individual, maybe it's task completion rates or, how often are they updating the project or
Yeah. It all comes down to understanding what actions are most closely tied to users getting that core value from what you're building.
So let's bring this back to, Integromat and Mixpanel.
Sure.
What do those, active definitions actually look like in practice?
So with Mixpanel, they landed on a definition of 2 or more users viewing a report within a week.
Okay.
It was that combination of collaboration and that regular engagement that signaled a truly active account for them.
Which makes sense, given what they're, focused on, these teams using data to make decisions.
Right.
Now, Integromat had a little bit of an evolution there, right?
They did. Initially, they kept it very, very simple.
Okay.
At least one active scenario meant an account was active.
But I'm sensing that didn't quite paint the full picture.
Right. They started to realize that this very, very simple definition didn't necessarily reflect the accounts that were truly engaged and driving revenue.
Because you could have someone just like set it and forget it.
Totally.
And they're on a free plan. And it's
Yeah.
like, okay, well, that doesn't really tell you if they're getting value or going to convert.
Exactly. So they dug a little deeper and realized they needed to consider more than just the presence of active scenarios.
So what did they land on? What were like the metrics they used to refine that definition?
So they ended up focusing on 2 key factors. One, the number of operations consumed, which is essentially a measure of how much their automation engine is being used.
Okay.
And 2, the presence of multiple active scenarios.
Okay.
And this kind of more nuanced approach really helped them separate, the casual users from those power users who were really, deeply engaged with the platform.
And I'm guessing this is all directly tied to their business model.
100%. This is where we get to the concept of the key consumption metric, or KCM, which the author stresses is absolutely crucial.
Yeah, give us a little refresher on that. Like, what is that and why does it matter so much?
So your KCM is the one metric that's directly tied to revenue generation.
Okay.
It's the lifeblood of your business, and
Mhm.
everything you measure and optimize for should ultimately, feed into it.
So not vanity metrics like signups and downloads. It's like, are they actually pulling out their wallets?
Precisely. And for Integromat, their KCM was those operations consumed. So the more operations a user consumed, the more value they were getting, and the more likely they were to upgrade to a paid plan.
Which makes the initial definition of active like kind of a head scratcher.
It is, yeah.
In retrospect.
Yeah. They realized that simply having a lot of users with, one basic scenario wasn't really moving the needle on their KCM.
Right.
They needed to encourage users to build more complex workflows, to really dig in and utilize, platform's full capabilities.
Right.
That's what drove operations consumption and ultimately revenue.
So their definition of active had to evolve to really reflect what truly mattered
Exactly.
for the bottom line.
It's a great example of how, understanding your KCM should directly shape how you define and measure active users.
Right.
If your definition isn't aligned with your KCM, you're essentially flying blind.
Right. And probably wasting a lot of effort and energy and resources chasing the wrong things.
For sure, yeah.
So let's bring this to our listeners. If I'm like, I'm a SaaS founder, I'm a product manager, how do I even figure out what my KCM is and then actually use that to define active in a way that makes sense for my business?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, and it's something that the author, really encourages, readers to really grapple with.
Yeah.
It starts with understanding your business model, inside and out.
Okay, so if you're a subscription, maybe it's MRR, maybe if it's more transactional, it's, number of transactions processed or something like that.
Exactly. And once you have that firm grasp on your KCM, you can start to work backward and identify the user actions that are most closely correlated with it.
So in the source material, they talk about this aha moment, right? It's this point when a user truly understands the value of the product.
Yeah.
How does that tie into defining active?
So the author argues that your definition of active should actually revolve around those aha moments.
Oh.
Because once a user experiences that value, they're far more likely to become truly engaged with your product and ultimately contribute to your KCM.
So if I can identify what those like key actions are that lead to those moments, those are probably good indicators.
Exactly. It's about identifying those behaviors that signal, this person's hooked.
Yeah.
They get it. They're going to stick around.
So it's about figuring out what makes your users go, aha, this is it. This is what I needed.
Yeah.
And then building that into your definition of active.
And that takes us beyond just like the surface level metrics, right?
Right.
It's about really digging into that user behavior, understanding the why behind the what.
It's like, it reminds me of this time I was working on this language learning app.
Okay.
And we were initially focused on active, meaning, are they completing a certain number of lessons per week?
Sure.
But then we realized that that wasn't really the whole story.
Right, because someone could just be mindlessly clicking through and not engaging.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So then it's like, okay, well, how often are they using the speaking practice feature?
Yes.
How many times are they like looking up a new word? Like those actions were way more indicative of like actual engagement and progress.
And those aha moments often happen, when they experience the product, helping them achieve something meaningful in their own lives, right?
Right.
So, in your language example, it's that moment when someone can successfully hold a basic conversation.
Right. They're using it.
In their target language. Right.
It's not just passive. They're actually doing it.
Exactly. Yeah. And those are the stories you want to be able to tell, right?
Right.
Stories of real people achieving real results with your product.
Because those are what fuel growth.
Exactly.
That's how you convince other people that it can work for them too.
100%.
So as you're thinking about defining active for your own product, what are those moments of transformation?
Yeah.
Like what are the actions that say this user is on the path to success?
Totally. And don't be afraid to challenge those initial assumptions too.
Oh yeah.
Right. What you initially believe is a key indicator of engagement might turn out to be a total red herring.
Totally.
So the key is to stay curious, keep experimenting, and always be willing to, let the data guide you.
So, our listener right now is probably thinking like, okay, this is great, but where do I even start? What's the one thing you want them to take away from this deep dive?
If you're feeling lost in this sea of metrics, I'd say go back to the user.
Okay.
Really try to visualize that person who's just experienced the core value of your product.
Yeah.
What did they do? What did that aha moment look like for them?
Because that's your North Star.
Exactly. Use that as your compass to navigate, this world of SaaS metrics.
Love it.
Define active in a way that really reflects those moments of truth, and you'll be well on your way to building a product and a business that truly resonates with your users.
Awesome. Well, that is a wrap on another deep dive. We hope this was helpful and that it gave you some things to think about, some actionable insights for your own SaaS journey.
Absolutely.
And if you're listening, we want to hear from you. Like, what are the aha moments that you've either experienced as a user or even better, seen in your own product? So hit us up on social media. Let's keep this conversation going.
Oh, sure.
Until next time, happy diving.